Before 1812, one man controlled the fate of Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte commanded an army that moved with lethal speed, dismantling the Austrian, Prussian, and Russian empires in rapid succession. But his invasion of Russia broke that winning streak. Freezing temperatures and mass starvation wiped out hundreds of thousands of his veteran troops. By 1814, a coalition of European powers forced him off the throne and exiled him to Elba, a tiny island in the Mediterranean. The victorious nations assumed the war was over. They believed a commander who had conquered a continent would quietly accept a life in confinement. They were wrong. In early 1815, Napoleon slipped away from Elba under the cover of darkness and sailed straight back to France. During a period we now call the 100 Days, the very troops sent to arrest him instead rallied to his side. Within weeks, he marched into Paris and reclaimed his crown without firing a single shot. The panicked European powers immediately mobilized. Two massive armies gathered to the north in Belgium, a British-led force under Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, and a Prussian army commanded by Gebhard Leiberecht von Blücher. But right now, their forces were separate. This shows Napoleon's only path to survival. He had to strike north into Belgium and physically wedge his forces between the British and the Prussians before they could merge. Whoever closed that gap first would win. The campaign was entirely dictated by the clock. On June 17th, the day before the battle, a torrential downpour soaked the Belgian countryside, turning the fields of Waterloo into a thick, clinging mud. Early 19th century cannons weighed thousands of pounds. In dry conditions, they recoil smoothly and can be easily repositioned by crews. In deep mud, they sink, lose their firing range, and become nearly impossible for horses to drag forward. Facing this saturated terrain on the morning of June 18th, Napoleon made a crucial call. He ordered his troops to hold their positions, waiting several hours for the summer sun to dry the ground. By waiting for better artillery conditions, he surrendered the entire morning. The British and Prussians were still marching toward each other, and Napoleon had just handed them the exact resource he couldn't afford to lose. When the ground finally dried enough to advance, French infantry launched brutal, hand-to-hand assaults on fortified British positions, focusing heavily on a defended farmhouse called Hougoumont. Seeking a breakthrough, the French unleashed their heavy cavalry, sending wave after wave of armor-clad horsemen sprinting across the open fields toward the British lines. Wellington anticipated this. He ordered his men into tightly packed infantry squares, solid blocks of soldiers several ranks deep, pointing a dense wall of bayonets outward in every direction. A 1,000-pound horse will not willingly impale itself on a row of steel spikes. Instead of crashing through the ranks, the animals instinctively swerved, riding harmlessly down the open lanes between the squares. The French cavalry reformed and charged repeatedly, but the squares held. Without infantry support to break the physical formations, the horsemen were simply picked off by British musket fire. Napoleon was bleeding his military strength against an immovable object, and with every passing hour, his strategic window was slamming shut. That morning delay caught up with him. Late in the afternoon, Blücher's Prussian army emerged from the woods on the eastern edge of the battlefield. They drove straight into Napoleon's exposed right flank, ripping through his thinly defended lines. French forces were abruptly pinned. They were exhausting themselves trying to break the British in the front, and now they had to pivot to fight off an entirely fresh army attacking from the side. The race was over. The British and Prussians had successfully united, catching the French army in a vice. Out of time and out of options, Napoleon committed his absolute last reserve, the Imperial Guard. These were his elite, veteran shock troops, sent straight up the middle in a desperate bid to shatter the British center. But as the Guard crested a ridge, rows of hidden British infantry stood up and fired a devastating point-blank volley directly into their ranks. The survivors faltered. For the first time in their history, the Imperial Guard turned and retreated down the hill. When the rest of the French army saw their most invincible soldiers running, panic rippled through the ranks. The lines dissolved, and the entire military structure collapsed into a chaotic retreat. Napoleon surrendered shortly after, abdicating his throne for the final time. He was shipped to St. Helena, an isolated rock in the South Atlantic, where he died 6 years later. This map illustrates the reality established at the Treaty of Vienna. With Napoleon gone, victorious powers redrew the continent's borders. By expanding Prussia, Austria, and the Netherlands, they constructed a physical buffer zone around France, engineered to maintain a strict balance of power. A few hours of morning rain, a rigid defensive formation, and a perfectly timed flanking maneuver stripped Napoleon of his empire, locking Europe into a continental peace that held for nearly a century.